Hello and welcome to this video on Wysteria as a species for bonsai. You'll find that just about all examples of Wysteria as used for bonsai are generally within the medium or very large categories, simply because the clusters of flowers that hang down from them need, considerable height to hang from. There are exceptions, but as a general rule, this is the first place to begin. Thankfully, beginners are a good candidate for this, simply because, they are a resilient species. They can deal with a great deal of maltreatment, but their primary feature will be their flowers. After the flowers are finished, the trunk and just about all the other structure is hidden under the leaves that proliferate extensively across it, along with tendril-like growth. As a result, however, the Wysteria isn't really suitable for much in terms of the summer and autumn displays, but you may find that the branch structure can make for a very attractive winter display. In general terms, as weird as it is to say, Wysteria are part of the legume family. There are 4 primary genuses that make this up, but primarily the examples we talk about come from China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, parts of Canada, and the eastern United States. As a consequence of this, Wysteria has been effectively introduced to just about everywhere across the world, barring Antarctica. The name itself isn't really the name proper, it's just the, for lack of a better way of putting it, anglicized version of it. It's also sometimes given the name glycine. For that reason, although we will refer to these as Wysteria, you may know them by slightly different naming concepts elsewhere. For the most part, it can be grown in just about all conditions, but keeping it indoors can be a bit of a challenge, but not impossible, which is thankfully one benefit to it, particularly if you're in an environment that is less than hospitable to bonsai over winter. There are 10 specific species of Wysteria that are used, with colours ranging from pink to white and even dark purple. Generally speaking, you're not going to use Wysteria for a lot of styles. It's pretty much limited to formal, upright, slanting, and cascade. You can, for the most part, keep them indoors, just with some care, but as with most bonsai, they are better off outside. The degree to which they grow will depend largely on which particular species you've chosen. Strangely enough, Japanese species do much better outdoors than they would indoors, whereas others are slightly better indoors. The reason Japanese varieties are much better outside is that they need not only the full sun, but a period of dormancy in winter. That period of dormancy isn't necessarily available if kept indoors. Kept indoors and you're comfortable inside as well. If your house is very cold, then likely your plant will experience dormancy, and you're going to be very uncomfortable. Wysteria, due to their nature, need incredible amounts of sunlight, and that's simply because they grow very aggressively. They go from practically nothing to spreading everywhere within a period of weeks. If they don't get sun, they don't grow. It's that simple. Because of this increased growth, and noting that they do have relatively large leaves that are quite thin, they need a lot of water. This is because the water within the plant and the soil to an extent will perspire out or evaporate out. Some use the idea of planting your Wysteria in its pot and then placing that pot in either a shallow bowl or similar container, or simply above it. This is helpful in that it prevents the tree from drying out excessively. In autumn and winter, it needs to be kept moist but not wet. And that's the challenge in winter, particularly if you're using a very organic matter-rich soil. You do need to fertilize them, and your choice of fertilizer will vary, but for the most part, we do recommend our standard approach of use a diluted liquid fertilizer, all-purpose fertilizer, for most of the year, every other week, except during the peak of winter and at the start of spring. With regards to the off week to this, we recommend something like a fish emulsion or similar that's intended not necessarily to support the growth of the plant above the soil, but rather to support the growth of the root mass below the soil or in the soil. It's noteworthy that you should try and avoid using excessive amounts of fertilizer that have high nitrogen content, and that's because the Wysteria will increase leaf growth, as is true of most plants if they're given extra nitrogen, but this will come at the expense of flowers. Wysteria itself really doesn't need extra nitrogen no matter what, and that's simply because it can draw out most of what it needs from the atmosphere. And so you're really not gaining anything other than wasting good fertilizer for something that doesn't need to happen. Generally speaking, you want to use a fertilizer high in potassium and phosphorus in early spring and late winter to support the flowering of your Wysteria. After the flowering is completed, you then begin pruning aggressively. Again, this boils down to the fact that the Wysteria will grow out very quickly as a vine, and because of this, you're going to find that it grows and grows and grows unless you cut it back. The advantages of this are reasonably straightforward, but the most obvious will be that you encourage ramification. Interestingly enough, the places in which you cut will also fall off themselves, so you cut back to a certain point, but not hard against the branch, as there will be a degree of dieback. Once this dieback is finished, that part of the branch will simply fall off of its own accord, and then down the track you'll find that a branch starts growing there again. You also don't want to cut off any shoots that are short but also flowering. This is important, as if you cut them off, you won't have flowers, which is rather obviously disappointing given that the primary feature of this is its massive display of flowers. You'll also want to thin out the foliage throughout summer. Again, this is to let light through to the inner parts of it. You shouldn't totally defoliate a Wysteria either. Partial defoliation, either by doing it segment by segment of the tree, or by removing some leaves and letting new ones start growing in, and then removing the older, larger leaves, is the best approach. As mentioned, pruning away large sections or large branches should only be done when there are no more flowers present. Wiring is generally not a suggestible idea, largely because of how quickly it grows and the difficulties in removing wire once it's fully developed. It can, however, be done. You should not wire until the flowers have completed their cycle, however, and that again boils down to the nature of wire cutting into branches, damaging them, and preventing the flowers from developing. No leaf buds and no flower buds means no display. Repotting is fairly typical, that is, the younger Wysterias, those up to about 5 years and sometimes up to 10, get repotted every 2 years, and this is again to support that extreme in growth. The older trees are done much less frequently, between 5 and 10 years in some cases. Pruning for older repotted trees is a bit more of a challenge, and that largely boils down to the fact that they don't like to be pruned at that point. This also leads to a challenge that they get quite root-bound within their pot, so you'll find that it's quite difficult to repot older Wysterias. They don't like to have their roots pruned in the same way they don't like their branches to be pruned as much. These can be worked around by either up-potting or by other creative solutions, or by gradually working away at the root mass. The most significant threats you'll face are your fairly typical issues for these sorts of vines, they being powdery mildew and similar. You pretty much pluck these out as soon as you identify them, and you should avoid most of your problems. In some regions you'll find that things like galls and cankers will occur. Unfortunately, these can only be cut out, and that can be quite devastating to your bonsai. The other noteworthy issue is that, as mentioned, in winter they don't like being overly wet. This can lead to root rot, or if they're left in not particularly good soil. In some regions, and this is only in certain areas, you'll find that there are borers that particularly focus on the Wysteria, and unfortunately there's very little to be done once these get into the Wysteria itself, and they will pretty much kill the tree. Depending on the type of wisteria you've bought, but as a general rule, you'll find most do not bloom until they're about 10 years old. The other concern with that, though, is that the flowers then lead to seed pods, and these seed pods can actually be poisonous, so you should be careful with that. Short version of this is that wisteria bonsai can be beautiful, and they really can be. They can be very amazing examples. However, they do have some pretty big issues, and they require a lot more maintenance and preparation, which is why they're most certainly not beginner-friendly. There's something that someone can be given to learn from, but don't expect significant results or flower displays given the time frame required. They're often more of a long-term project, either out of curiosity or passion, rather than any real singular interest in developing a particular example or specimen. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.